Big tech companies, more often than not linked with governments and intelligence agencies, have always done studies about addiction and negative effects of social media. The goal of those studies was to see if they are succeeding at altering the natural way a human mind operates, more addicted, more hungry for social media content. The public has held Instagram accountable for causing damage to our children's mental health. The issue that has been overlooked is that those companies never even intended to be beneficial to anyone's mental health. They hire teams of overqualified professionals just to work on making the apps as addictive as possible. Having access to billions of people's lives, the big tech companies have discovered hidden psychological issues within the mind, and instead of releasing that knowledge to the public, exploited those weaknesses for decades now, feeding consumers ever more addicting, emotionally disturbing, and time-consuming content. Big tech thoroughly understood the twisted psychology of content creators before releasing their apps on the public. Greed, validation seeking, creating false narratives of prosperous lives, incentivizing adultery and drama, pushing content bordering on pornography. The social media platforms turned socializing into a nightmare. Richard Fried is a child and adolescent psychologist, says, adults get affected by not working properly and are getting more distracted, but kids are being robbed. The type of manipulation and isolation persuasive technology creates pulls kids away from real-life engagements like family, focusing on school, making friends. Girls are more inclined to fall prey to social media, and there are serious effects on mental health struggles, since social media can be hurtful for young girls, and there's been an increase in suicide. He ended the interview saying, "We were given one window into what was happening when Facebook internal documents openly talked about exploiting the emotions of teens, tracking teens feeling insecure, worthless, stressed, useless, and like a failure. They were bragging to stakeholders about their ability to do this. I think psychology is going to be in remarkable trouble when parents find out that psychologists are developing the very products they can't get their kids off of. There's too much money to be made." Eel, 39, the author of Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, has spent several years consulting for the tech industry, teaching techniques he developed by closely studying how the Silicon Valley giants operate. The technologies we use have turned into compulsions, if not full-fledged addictions, Eel writes. It's the impulse to check a message notification. It's the pull to visit YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter for just a few minutes, only to find yourself still tapping and scrolling an hour later. He explains the subtle psychological tricks that can be used to make people develop habits, such as varying the rewards people receive to create a craving or exploiting negative emotions that can act as triggers. Feelings of boredom, loneliness, frustration, confusion, and indecisiveness often instigate a slight pain or irritation and prompt an almost instantaneous and often mindless action to quell the negative sensation. Tristan Harris, a 33-year-old former Google employee turned vocal critic of the tech industry. All of us are jacked into this system, he says. All of our minds can be hijacked. Our choices are not as free as we think they are. Harris, who has been branded the closest thing Silicon Valley has to a conscience, insists that billions of people have little choice over whether they use these now ubiquitous technologies, and are largely unaware of the invisible ways in which a small number of people in Silicon Valley are shaping their lives. That red icon is now everywhere. When smartphone users glance at their phones dozens or hundreds of times a day, they are confronted with small red dots beside their apps, pleading to be tapped. Red is a trigger color, Harris says. That's why it is used as an alarm signal. The most seductive design, Harris explains, exploits the same psychological susceptibility that makes gambling so compulsive, variable rewards. When we tap those apps with red icons, we don't know whether we'll discover an interesting email, an avalanche of likes, or nothing at all. It is the possibility of disappointment. In an experiment done by Robert Sapolsky, monkeys were given food treats when they pressed a bar 10 times after seeing the light. Dopamine is released right away when the monkeys saw the signal, even before they had worked for it. Data from last year shows that 4 billion people worldwide spent several hours each day on social media platforms, prompting comparisons to addiction. In the hopes of finding out what drives social media junkies to spend so much of their waking day online, researchers analyzed more than 1 million posts from over 4,000 users. Their findings suggest that the behavior of many users was consistent with reward learning. This is a long-established psychological concept which says actions may be driven and reinforced by rewards. Those who receive more likes seem to be driven to post even more frequently. The researchers now say social media use appears to be driven by similar principles that lead rats to maximize their food rewards in lab tests, like a Skinner box. For such an experiment, animals are put in a box where they are dispensed food by completing specific actions like pulling a lever. The Skinner box is a chamber, often small, that is used to conduct operant conditioning research with animals. Within this chamber, there is usually a lever or key that an individual animal can operate to obtain a food or water source within the chamber as a reinforcer. The chamber is connected to electronic equipment that records the animal's lever pressing or key pecking, allowing for the precise quantification of behavior. The device allowed Skinner to deliver each of his 4 potential outcomes, which are positive or negative reinforcement, as well as positive or negative punishment. Advertisers use a number of techniques based on operant conditioning to influence consumer behavior, such as variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the so-called slot machine effect, which encourages viewers to keep watching a particular channel in the hope of seeing a desirable outcome, e.g., winning a prize. In modern games, matchmaking isn't based on skill and doesn't offer skill-based matchups instead, because most game developers use the engagement-optimized matchmaking, short EOMM. Through trial and error on evolving neural networks, it can predict which outcome a game is going to have. Matchmaking is purposely rigged to create unfair matches by using a fake rank systems, which doesn't represent players' true skill, and by rigging in-game mechanics, range, hitboxes, command responsiveness, projectile speed, skill shot assist, dodge assist, etc. Matchmaking also takes into account the amount of money you have spent on a game, psychological and interface design pattern, which made you spend, whether you have recently spent money or not, whether you are streaming or not, whether you are a professional player or not. They take into account your emotional connection to the game. Normal matchmaking, skill-based, assumes that every game should be as even as possible and uses various stats to match skill with skill. It might just use your win-lose ratio. It might use ELO. If it's a team game, there's usually an algorithm to determine how to balance teams with players of varying skill levels. An angry player says, "Game is built entirely around EOMM, engagement-optimized matchmaking, and nothing else." Every time you hit start, the game begins its manipulation and machine learning to try to addict you and take your money from you. Fun is not the goal, it is a side effect goal, because fun leads to more playtime. If the graphs showed depression leads to more spending, then the game would try to cause depression. This rigging is in place to cause dopamine surges when you go 18-2, and then dopamine crashes when you go 1-5. It's rigged to ensure this, creating the same emotional roller coaster as a casino. Another disillusioned player says, "What I have noticed is that, like clockwork, whenever I take a long break from one of my accounts, not necessarily the game in general, then come back, I get a long string of unlosable games. I win more than 20 games with maybe 1 to 3 losses in that time. Then a switch flips. Not gradually, immediately. I lose more than 10 games in a row. One might argue that it's because I climbed too high and now can't play against the opponents I'm getting. But I have multiple reasons why this can't be the case. It's an immediate reversal, not a gradual shift where games get gradually harder and I start losing more and more. I will go from the easiest games ever to unwinnable games in just one game. I believe this is designed to get players who haven't played in a while hooked back in and keep them playing." Another player concludes, EOMM is probably here to stay. It's in all of the popular FPS games nowadays. Only a small amount of people understand this at the moment, and it will probably take years before people start really catching on to how matchmakers are working nowadays. Playing violent video games causes more aggression, bullying, and fighting. Simulating violence, such as shooting guns and hand-to-hand combat in video games, can cause real-life violent behavior. Many perpetrators of mass shootings played violent video games. Now, let's journey back to the heart of Silicon Valley, where the architects of our digital world hold immense power over our lives. It's time to shed light on the insidious underbelly of social media and its manipulation of teenagers, a subject demanding our urgent attention. While the debate over the impact of violent video games on the behavior of the youth has been a long-standing one, it's essential to recognize that the true crime isn't confined to pixels on a screen. The more sinister plot unfolds within the realms of big tech, where the real casualties are not virtual but painfully real. The deliberate scheme orchestrated by tech giants to addict individuals, particularly the vulnerable youth, is a tragedy that transcends the boundaries of any virtual battleground. The consequences extend beyond the confines of a game, as addiction-driven despair often leads to a heartbreaking reality: suicide. It's imperative to shift parental focus from the controversies surrounding video game violence to the tangible, insidious harm being inflicted by those who manipulate minds for profit. Allowing the deliberate scheme orchestrated by tech giants to get as many addicted, particularly the vulnerable youth, is a horror unfolding now. We must demand accountability and justice for those whose innocence is sacrificed at the altar of digital manipulation. It is high time to confront the giants, for our youth deserve a future free from the shackles of algorithmic exploitation. Social media used by minors has significantly increased and has been linked to depression and suicidality. Simultaneously, age-adjusted suicide rates have steadily increased over the past decade in the United States, with suicide being the second most common cause of death in youth. Hence, the increase in suicide rate parallels the simultaneous increase in social media use. In addition, the rate of non-suicidal self-injury ranges between 14% and 21% among young people. Evidence suggests that self-harming youth is more active on online social networks than youth who do not engage in self-harm behavior. The role of online social networking on deliberate self-harm and suicidality in adolescence, with a focus on negative influence, was assessed by conducting a systematized literature review. It was found that social networking websites are utilized by suicidal and self-harming youth as a medium to communicate. In the twisted landscape of big tech, these cries for help often fall into the hands of influential figures and tech leaders who, instead of offering support, exploit the vulnerability of the distressed, as we have learned.
The digital realm, meant to be a space for connection and understanding, becomes a dangerous landscape where the vulnerable are preyed upon, amplifying their struggles rather than alleviating them. As we confront this harrowing reality, we must question the ethical standards of those who wield immense power in shaping social media.
The very essence of these platforms, seemingly crafted to foster understanding, undergoes a transformation into a perilous terrain where vulnerability is not met with compassion, but instead manipulated by enigmatic forces.